All right, so the Polycrisis series, last week we had a talk by Mona Ali, who's spelling out a lot of the geopolitics and economic reasons for why this term polycrisis has emerged. And if you were to talk, there were some questions about institutional structures and forms of agency, which were coming up, which we kind of started to open up a little bit. We didn't get very far with it, I don't think. And so this week's talk, oh, sorry, before we get to this week's talk, what happened? It's still there, okay. So this week's talk is going to be about Bahar, and I'll introduce Bahar in a minute. But just to say, sorry, problem there. All right. So the next week's talk is by Gary, who's teaching on the MFA Fine Art. And the last talk in the series by Miyu was going to be on the 27th of February, but that's now a strike day, and Miyu has kindly agreed to have the talk on the 13th of February. So we'll just have 4 talks in the series, which is what we wanted originally. So tonight's talk is by Bahar. I'm not going to give you too much background into Bahar's work and so on, because I think that's the subject of the talk for the most part. Bahar's showing internationally, places like Tate, Venice Biennale, Transmediale previously, and this week as well, I think. So extensive exhibition record. You can find Bahar's work you can find Bahar's work online. She's also director, running, founder of a site called Weird Economies, which I think you're going to talk about, ish. I think it's weiirdeconomies.com. Okay, weiirdeconomies.com. So there'll be a quick introduction to that, and I can send out links afterwards as well. And Bahar is also a writer who's published in some of the best places to see art writing, like eFlux and so on. So Bahar's also completing her PhD at Goldsmiths in the next few months. And I wanted to invite Bahar partly because I think the talk she's going to present is very much about the reasons why polycrisis has emerged, not just as a kind of external, the impact of external causes, external effects within a well-functioning neoliberalism, but actually it's within the specifics of how neoliberalism sets up economies and markets, that this notion of crisis has to emerge and basically lead to the kind of problems that we're facing now. So that's a very quick overview. Bahar will give some more specifics about ideologies of neoliberalism, which kind of entail this perma-crisis condition and crisis on many fronts simultaneously. But I also wanted to invite Bahar because I think Bahar represents and is kind of a paradigm in a way for what I think is a changing notion of what an artist is, which is somebody who covers both artistic practice and theoretical adventure and writing and many disciplines simultaneously. And I think it's a different model to certainly the modern artist, but I think also the contemporary artist in terms of how specific the claims of the work are and how to follow through on it, both through like all the media that Bahar occupies and uses. So I think there's a kind of model of practice here in Bahar's work, which I think speaks to, if you remember the slide last week about how contemporary art is a sort of art adequate and appropriate to neoliberalism. And the question is, what happens if you start thinking about post-neoliberal phase? I want to situate Bahar's practice in that transition. Not that Bahar's necessarily thinking about it that way, but I think it's a sort of framework to kind of understand what practice is and what artists do and what they can do in changing conditions such as we're facing now. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Bahar. So it's quite a momentous introduction. I'm not sure if you want to live up to it.
Thanks so much, Suhail, for the invitation and the introduction. I mean, it's the best place to present this work. Also, what Suhail left out was he's been my supervisor for the past few years at the art department here. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about it started from reading Suhail's work. So it's really a conversation that comes after studying his work with other colleagues when I started thinking about these questions in, around 2015. And I'm gonna actually be quite informal and walk you through a trajectory of a set of projects and where it led me in my research. So please, I know it's, I don't think it's gonna be that intimidating, but if there's any questions about terms you don't know, really feel free to, just shout out because I can't see your faces now, but yeah, stop me and ask questions if you need to. So my work, like I said, in a, this version of this informal introduction to the work, as I'm gonna be improvising the talk. So basically, I started thinking about the relationship between art and economy at large, or art and market at large, around 2015, for some concrete conditions that came about my practice, my artistic practice at the time. And it kind of led me in this path of thinking about economy in a more in-depth and complex way, and ultimately arriving at detecting a different turn in economic discourse, or economic frameworks, that's finance and financialization. So where I am at right now, to kind of like situate you in the current moment, and then take you through the history. I'm thinking about art and finance in the relationship through speculation, the concept of speculation. And this is a space that art, finance, philosophy share maybe since the modernist turn. So I try to foreground the question of money and funding and things that are usually in the background of artistic practice, to bring it to the forth and try to think about it theoretically, conceptually, and experimentally in the works. Not like all the works, I would say, but a set of works are kind of like directly dealing with this idea of thinking about money in a more playful and experimental way. And so when I talk about art and finance, one side of this kind of exploration, as what Sohail described, is to reflect on my own positionality and my own subjectivity as an artist. So there's a meta-reflection on how historically the figure of the artist and the financialized subject start to merge into each other in ways that are not so distinct, and these boundaries are more porous between, if you want to even like call it, someone who's like working in finance and someone who's working as an art practitioner. I'll tell you more concretely what I mean by these kinds of like abstract ideas when we get closer to the description of the projects. But maybe just we can already start by, let me move the slides. This is also an old presentation, so don't mind the titles. So this is a work I was involved with in 2015, more of a research project with a colleague in Beirut, Ghalia Sadawi. She's wearing red Adidas jacket in the top left photo. Ghalia is also now at Goldsmith. Some of you might know her at Center for Research Architecture. So when we started working on this project, there are a set of circumstances in both our lives in Beirut. Ghalia was running this institution, this program at this kind of renowned like art institution, and I was her student. I was finishing this study program, and I was also working with some art institutions in Beirut. And both of us are going through some, institutional, not very comforting like situations with the figures there. And basically, we started to think about this condition we're going through more politically, meaning that we try to diagnose why is it that we can't make a kind of correct response to what we're going through. And it's basically meant that we couldn't build any alliance between the art figures or art workers in Beirut and ourselves, and neither them could do it together. So this problem of like not being able to build solidarity between art workers in the face of nepotism, mainly nepotism, and some kind of like informal structure that has become standardized and has turned into the routine, was really at the core of what we are trying to address. So we started to like ask this question, bring this question to the front of how can we regulate the art scene, which seems kind of easy and maybe not that complex at first sight, but once you start dealing with it, then you're really trying to answer the entire question posed at political structures and political thought, which is then I'll tell you what I mean by that. And at the same time, we were reading people like Sohail, and I don't know how much you've been familiarized with Sohail's theories, but on a theoretical level, we are trying to think about contemporary art as what kind of a market model it is. And the problem is, like, if we try to think about regulating the art market in Beirut, it wouldn't really address the problems we are facing, because Beirut is one small location or node in a network of, in a very transnational, translocal formation that is the art market. And actually this institution that we're both based in, it was sort of enacting this satellite space, like spaceship that which you might be familiar with it yourself, but like most contemporary art institutions at these days at urban centers are. So it was very difficult to trace like who's inside and who's outside, because it was this kind of like airport terminal that most known figures on the planet would kind of like move through. So if you start thinking of how to regulate this this institution, like you wouldn't really go that far by thinking about the location itself. But anyways, we ran like a few research groups and like survey groups that are pictured here in the institution and outside with people who are working in the art scene there. And the question we are trying to ask was how to regulate the contemporary artwork. It didn't lead to lead that far, because what we noticed was the conditions of our precarity. I had to move elsewhere. Ghalia had 6 different jobs to sustain herself. So in a way, what we were facing as this impossibility of like building solidarity between art workers kind of took the it overcame our effort to actually address the problem. So the project kind of fizzled out, but the questions for me remained, which it was carried forward to this project that almost happened like simultaneously with art protocol called Block, Building Leverage Over creative capitalism. And block was, so it came out of the context of a residency in Bern, Switzerland, ran by Tirdad Zolgad at the time. Tirdad's also, Sohail is familiar with Tirdad. Tirdad's also kind of like thinking about the same questions, and what Tirdad's long-term project is to think about art and gentrification together. So what I was trying to describe with, building solidarity between artists, once I started to get involved with Tirdad's work, the terms of the kind of thinking shifted from maybe more of a self-obsessed, trying to figure out this category of the artistic class or the creative class that we were, and try to think about it in terms of how is it that the lack of alliance and solidarity with art workers is actually affecting larger class conditions outside the realm of art, which is a question that I don't think it's for me it's not fully realized yet. It's like that question of how do we define this class in relation to that other class. But basically what's coming to Tirdad's project, as I said, the terms of the question for me shifted towards thinking about the reason that art has, one of the main reasons that, as we know, contemporary arts, let's say, and it's distinct from art at large, contemporary art is so complicit in gentrification processes and regeneration of cities and beautification of these real estate projects, has to do with art workers not being able to form alliances and networks of solidarity. So everybody was coming, the 6 of us who came into this residency, which Tirdad kind of selected one by one, had something to say or address the theme of the project with. So Tirdad was thinking about art and gentrification, as I said. And when we started, the framework was really, try to get out of the kind of usual, sad face and, the cynical mode of there's nothing to be done, because the fight is with capitalist structures at large, but to really, even in a vulgar way, try to imagine what could work, what could artists do, as a group of people that's neither symbolic nor representational, it doesn't turn into yet another performance in an art space addressing gentrification, and then we also become complicit in raising the value of those spaces, but actually to think about how we can shift it. And over 2 years, and this is also to the thanks to Tirdad, he because he also understood the question of sustainability and fighting precarity as something that matters in these institutional frameworks. So he extended the residency over 2 years. So it wasn't 6 people coming for 20 days and, just hanging out in Bern, using the resources quite literally and, adding to their portfolio and then leaving, and, another set of people come and replace them. So we did this program over 2 years. There are multiple gatherings coming together to work together. And slowly the idea kind of started to materialize as there's a problem that we can address through education and thinking about pedagogy in a more interesting way. Mainly, and in very basic terms, it's to think about why this kind of syllabus is not presented in the basic art education as we all went through. This is something that should be addressed in BA level education. So block became about this let's say, like quasi-educational model, and trying to think how we can infiltrate art education institutions and provide this kind of, multi-modular, so like 6 modules for the 6 of us to these institutions, and how to incentivize it for them. But I also, like, what was interesting about it was that it was also about system design, because again, in a meta way, we understood that as much as there's continuity in the format of the residency, but at the end of the day, we are going to go away and like it's just that long that a project with 6 people in the art world might last if you're living in different locations. So we try to put some thought into how we can make this model last without that much intervention by, the endless meetings. I mean, I wouldn't stand by all of the things I say because, like, these are part of the experiments, but the question of minimizing the, the meeting, the constant, the problem that, like, people talk about with meeting too many times, too often, with if you're doing like socialist political activism type of work. We try to minimize the meetings, but at the end of the day, it did kind of fizzle out. Also, like, maybe it lasted a bit longer for 2 years, but it did end up fizzling out. How am I doing with time, actually? I feel like maybe I'm staying too long on those. Yeah, I'm coming to that point. You asked. So, and then again, around the same time, all of these projects sort of overlapped. Thinking through the art protocol, thinking through Block, this idea of regulation on a large scale or transnational forms of governance kind of became key to my work. And so I started to read on precedents for thinking about transnational governance in non-capitalist frameworks. And one of the stories that, like, very immediately popped up in my research was the Soviet cybernetics projects, or the Soviet cybernetic economics projects, which around 2008, after the financial collapse, a lot of people started to kind of conjure, revive those ideas, mainly because there was a return to thinking about regulation on a large scale, again, as a response to financialization, to financial speculation. So rather than, it could replace the financial institutions that are kind of running rampant on a planetary scale. So I kind of started to dig deeper into this particular story in the Soviet Union. There's also a parallel model in Salvador Allende's Chile. You might know about Project Cybersyn, which was a slightly more democratic kind of account of how cybernetics was trying to evolve like economic frameworks at some point. But so I want to show you a clip of this, but before going there, I just tell you about the, what's kind of like significant about cybernetic projects then. Mainly it has to do, I mean, I want to jump over that part in the film, so I just give you the like very brief economic history account. What happened in 20th century in economic debates was this kind of back and forth controversy. I'm simplifying a lot, of course, between two camps, the socialist economists and the market proponents, which slowly kind of, now we know them as neoliberals, like the neoliberal original thinkers. And most of these conversations were organized around this debate called the socialist calculation problem. The socialist calculation problem was basically the challenge that neoliberals posed at socialists, that they can't regulate their economy because what they essentially wanted to do after the Soviet Revolution was to organize this kind of continent-wide mega nation as the Soviet Union, and to centralize a sort of like command economic model that can calculate distribution of resources across this landscape. And so there were a lot of like innovations with like linear mathematics that are really kind of like in the background of how cybernetics came about. But then the neoliberals were basically telling the socialists they can't achieve that because something very simple for them, that the market, before the invention of the computers, they're thinking of the market as a computer. And they're saying that the market does this calculation without any need for that kind of complex mathematics. It's something that runs on its own. It's automated. It's, this is where kind of like the esotericism also starts to be exposed. If you kind of like, maybe just like pay attention to these terms that comes up with the neoliberal discourse. So how they see the markets, that it's just, the famous expression is the invisible hand, but like neoliberals weren't, only satisfied with the invisible hand of the market. That makes these calculations, but there's even more kind of like, esoteric, like metaphysics involved. And yeah, basically the socialists then were trying to figure out how to use mathematics to make it function. But then by the time that computers were actually invented, you can imagine how, what it meant for socialist economists. Like they thought that they found the key to, unlock like this problem. So this is the origins of the Soviet cybernetics. Why it's important for this moment or for 2008 was that, well, as we know, Soviet Union didn't last, and it's, the system ended in the 90s, but the ghost of that system actually still presides in platform capitalism, in Amazon, in Walmart, in these mega digital platforms that actually have the capacity to do that kind of like mega scale, very complex calculation. They distribute resources in the same way. So this is where people started to talk about, well, maybe we need to actually capture these platforms. I mean, that wasn't the starting point, but it was where the debate became kind of mainstream, to capture those platforms for socialist means, to kind of, revive the dreams of Soviet cybernetics. So I'll just show a very brief clip of this, and then we can move on. Maybe actually from...
Если проблема социализма — это время, то есть бюрократия, слишком много переговоров, слишком много встреч, то скоростной социализм, электричество плюс статистика, могли бы преодолеть это ограничение. Цифровой социализм вступил в кровосмесительную связь с коммунистической революцией.
So, just a short clip. The film is online, available to public on Vimeo, if you look for it. So yeah, maybe also to say like the location where the LiDAR scans were taken. And when I made this film, it wasn't like, you know, every other film was made with LiDAR. Now it looks really dated. It looked kind of cool back in the day in 2018. But where the LiDAR scans were taken was this very strange location, which is a cathedral in southern Kiev. Well, it has a different kind of like signification nowadays. But it was basically the birthplace of the first Soviet computer, the mainframe in the Soviet Union, in this very strange forest, like mythical forest, that, you know, when the revolution happened, basically it was turned into a mental asylum, like the revolutionaries took over the location and turned it into a mental asylum. And then when the Nazis invaded that area, they killed all the patients and turned it into a military hospital. And then after the war, they took back the building and turned it into these like strange science labs. So the sciences that weren't taken well in the center was, you know, expelled to these like remote areas. So it's important to know that kind of, the merging of these three, very strange realms of, theology slash science slash madness that was, part of the background to this building, where, computers emerge. So yeah, I mean, now I can switch to a different moment in my research. Like, this is basically when I started my PhD, and as I started my PhD, I kind of started to have a mild critique of this previous work, and I tell you like how what are the details of it, but basically it was also a shift along the lines of like trying to understand what finance is on its own terms versus the older economic models, or like the regulatory contractual models I was trying to think about with after scarcity and with block and art protocol and after scarcity in a way. And what I mean by that is, again, like coming back to the figure of speculation, as this divide between what was understood as information, registered as information, and what was understood as knowledge in those conversations, also in the historical conversations. And so I went back to read some of the writings of Friedrich Hayek, which is kind of the father of that kind of right-wing neoliberal camp, like that's who people like refer to. And reading Hayek is quite interesting because it challenges some of the kind of like normalized thinking we have these days on the left about what market is. And it seems like we think about finance as like where or like we think about calculation as where kind of like that neoliberal thinking was manifested in in the contemporary moment. But actually the roots of that calculation, you probably can guess, like from this history that I gave, actually did derive from socialist thinking and from scaled socialist thinking. And so Hayek was always opposed to that kind of, hyper mathematicization of economic discourse. Not always, like maybe less than his guru, von Mises. But Hayek also had his own issues with mathematicization of economy. And basically to the point that by his later writings, it completely sounds metaphysical. So the way he's describing the market is that it's not just it's not just the calculator of this interrelational space between people that you can't capture as a whole, because each member of each person in a group only has a bit of a like small piece of information, and they would never be able to have that grander view on things. This was like in his earlier writings, but then like as it moves towards his later writings, he's talking about the market is actually where it's not the known but the unknown is captured and is regulated or turned into a numerical price index. So the price index, to summarize, is where the unknown is captured and turned into something that we can work with. And I think this has like quite a lot of kind of like consequences for especially a kind of leftist imaginary, especially thinking about socialist platforms. My argument would be it's not only the capture of these mega platforms, but also to understand what that speculative metaphysical essence that for neoliberals is captured by the market. Like to understand that thing is quite essential. for, the programs, the political programs that we're imagining now. And so the kind of rest of my work started to move into that direction. Weird Economies is one project that came about throughout the PhD here. It's weirdeconomies.com. So the idea was, originally the idea was to just, get together as a number of people who have a kind of speculative conscious thinking on, from whichever field they come from, but also with kind of a strong footing in art. Because, I was trying to enforce this idea that art also has something to say about speculation. So maybe that's where we can take our positions also seriously and try to think like what we can add to the debates on speculation. So it's manifested first as kind of a journal, let's say a multi-authored project with there's a glossary of finance, which is trying to rethink financial terminology as social concepts, as they all are. Like when we think about debt, when we think about credit, we know how they translate into everyday life, but to kind of bring that consciousness of this is not like an alien field, but we kind of like perform it even without dealing with future markets as financiers. And then there was this other side project called Fixes, which is like very short proposals for the future. So asking people to really put themselves in that speculative seat and try to imagine like a best case scenario, like someone like Joshua Simon, our first entry was communism. And yeah, different kinds of contributions, but also like more recently, and this is where I was hoping the project would go, was to kind of get out of the online space and try to think about its own like ecology, its own set of relationships with its environment, especially through those monetary relationships and its own investments. So everything we talk about within the glossary terms, like what is Weird Economies investment in various fields. So we're working with spaces in London, trying to frame projects around gentrification and try to think about, speculating other modes of engaging with the real estate crisis in London. And also other locations. So wherever like Weird Economies members are based, they're trying to kind of formulate projects that relate to that location and try to think imaginatively about economic structures there. And then I wanted to end on, I think I'm relatively, how much time do I have? Yeah. And where it's, like all of this, where it's led me is now going back to where I started with, part of the research was about this meta-reflection on the figure of the artist and the figure of the financier and how, these two categories start to collapse in the past few decades mainly. I mean, you can historicize it differently, but like maybe it's way more vivid and like, difficult to evade at this point. And so around this time, I was also thinking of this idea of Teslaism. It's a very kind of a playful concept. Like I wouldn't write a whole book on it yet, but it's just to kind of playfully address maybe a shift from something that once was called a neoliberal model to a financial model. And I know that you need to be familiar with, like, exactly what we mean by neoliberalism or, finance, but to very briefly address it. Someone like, a philosopher, thinker like Michel Ferrer would say neoliberalism didn't quite achieve the project that it wanted to achieve. So what it wanted to create was this profit-seeking, entrepreneurial subject, which what like most people think we are now. But actually what it led to was this portfolio building, credit-seeking subject, which sounds way more artistic than the entrepreneur even. We're all like portfolio makers. And that means that it's no more about making profit in the moment, but it's about raising the value of your assets or your shares. And what assets are, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to have shares in a bank or shares in in businesses. Like your skin tone, your bodily organs, your brain, your education, like everything you have is an asset. And so we've turned into these kinds of subjects that try to all we are doing is to raise the value of these assets rather than making profit in the moment. And I think this might start to resonate with artists. Like the point is not to sell a painting for $2 million right now. Maybe that's the point. Actually, it's not bad if you can get like $2 million, but probably you won't. But to make sure that you build these steps towards like getting to that goal at some point. So it's not quite the same kind of rational actor that we imagined in the past. There's something else happening here. And so when I was thinking about Teslaism for me is, again, a playful term to try to think about what finance is to industrial production. So not just as a subjectivity, not just as something, the speculative processes that are quite abstracted with future markets and with making money out of money, as they say, but like how it's seeped into industrial production, which is not usually how people discuss finance. And cars are always that kind of, the prime storytellers for telling this economic history. Like, if you know the terms, there was, the Fordist era, there was the post-Fordist era. So this is my kind of like claim to, something that emerges out of post-Fordism as, this shift to finance. And so Elon Musk becomes the kind of, prototypical figure that represents this shift. And the claim is that, all he is he's like a very good storyteller. He's a fabricator of storyteller. Good, I mean, what I mean by good. But he's effective in terms of being able to make a lot of money out of storytelling. And it doesn't mean that the stories are necessarily good. It's actually quite regressive, cyberpunk. Like the future is kind of not the innovative future that you might think about. It's actually a future that belongs to the 80s. But he knows how to, the relevance of that kind of future for to turn it into a form of populism that sells in a certain way. And of course, it's, this is the idea of branding and this is the idea of advertisement. But what I'm trying to say is that that really has taken over many aspects of production to the point that, like if you think about, again, these parallels with the art world, within like modern art, stages of modern art, there was a time that the infrastructure of an exhibition had to be hidden in the background, so you wouldn't reveal the cables and and how the monitor is like installed. But we come to a moment where everything is exposed, like you have to expose the infrastructure, and that's quite similar with how Tesla functions as, these factories, these glossy, shiny, beautiful objects that kind of look like iPhone boxes, and they land in these cool landscapes. So Berlin is very important for Musk as a location to build the gigafactory, because he's trying to appeal to that image of techno. So yeah, we can talk about it more. Maybe I just show the clip now, and then we see how much time we have. This was a project that was made for the Trezor Techno Club in the summer, like this summer. In pretty much a month, it was the first time I was playing around with game design tools with Unreal Engine, which also made a lot of sense in terms of thinking about world building and what Elon is doing. And also there's an idea of the drive, so the temporality of finance as just this idea of, maintaining the future for the sake of maintaining the future. So getting rid of the content, but just creating a sense of continuity that I felt like with game design is really captured. So yeah, and then last thing, like the prompt was, the curators wanted to show this kind of utopian, like they asked me to like make a utopian vision of Berlin with the techno scene there. And like I told them, there's no like great future for techno in Berlin. But the question I was trying to ask again playfully was that, knowing that techno emerged out of the post-Fordist condition after the demise of Fordism in Detroit as this utopian possibility for Black culture. So I kind of mirrored the question here, that what is the sound of the gigafactory? What's the sound of Tesla in Berlin? What sound comes out of this factory at this point? And it's a bit of a metaphorical, question, because I don't think the most emancipatory sound comes out of Tesla probably, but I think it's a good question to ask, like, if this condition that we describe as Teslaism, the kind of like hyper manifestation of gig economies and like the kind of, internet culture that we are sucked into, what kind of sound can come from that? So just maybe the first 10 minutes and I can end it here. So yeah, basically the rest of the film is Elon running to find the shareholder after party. Doesn't get there. Yeah, we can start.
All right, that's okay. So thank you, Bahar. That's kind of, there's a lot to discuss there. And normally I kind of do sort of long-involved kind of overviews of what people have said. What I really want to ask about is the move towards, okay, two or three things. One around the way you can do work with quite a high level of conceptual demand. Basically, you can address things at large scales, which I think is quite unusual in contemporary art. I don't know if you count yourself as a contemporary artist or not. I think not, but kind of maybe yeah. And then secondly, I want to go to the issue of polycrisis that's coming up more for speculation. But I think these things are quite far away from what you've discussed. And I'm aware there might be questions that people have about various points of Bahar's talk that you want to kind of go over or ask Bahar to speak about. Can I just see if anybody's got questions? Or just like, can you say again about something in the talk? No? Oh, there's one. Okay.
Sorry, it's muted. I don't know how to mute it.
What you were saying about teaching in A-level, I was just interested when you were talking about educating people about gentrification and the role of artists in that. And I was just interested to know more about what you were talking about teaching, like what that actually looked like.
Yeah, actually, thanks for bringing up education again, because I was running through things so much that I couldn't, give space to things that matter. But education, I would say that Locke, they didn't have that much of a conceptual thinking about and a methodology of like each of these modules on their own, so much as it was more about building a system of education that could work, that could sustain itself. Like it was really more of an exterior conversation. But actually coming to real economies, I think something that's shaping organically, which is really one of the points of real economies that matters to me the most. And I think, it makes sense in terms of thinking about speculation in generative terms, is thinking about education as activating that speculative space. So education has become, building a methodology for teaching on like financial activism, let's say. It's become something that has become part of the process of the work. So the past few times, it's all by kind of, by invitation and random commission, so it hasn't been really systemic. But I had the chance to do a program in Beirut last year and then another one in Alexandria in Egypt. And both of them became these frameworks that I could think about, maybe something that Sohail said, like bringing this larger scale, like very infrastructural, violent framework as finance to these very specific locations with participants from those locations. And ending on a speculative moment with a speculative exercise. So with Beirut, we invited this political economist from the American University of Beirut, and Lebanon has been going through this very extreme financial crisis. I used to live in Beirut, like I said. So I'm a bit familiar with the location. But Lebanon has been going through a very particular kind of banking crisis, which is very particular to the way its state functioned post the civil war. So there's a lot to kind of untangle there. And then we had this political economist who laid out the history of what went on in the system that led to the collapse. And then we broke into groups and tried to speculate on forms of financial activism that can come after. And I kind of skipped over that financial activism work, which is something that a quite literate kind of picked up from Michel Ferrer, who I really suggest you watch his lecture series that he did at Goldsmith a few years ago at the Forensic Architecture. It's all on Vimeo. And his recent book, I think 2018, called Invest the Activism. I can't remember the first one. Rated agency, yeah. So he's talking about how we should think about reputational platforms and ranking agencies as somewhere that we can hone in on as those like strategic, points to shift something around how financialization is working. And he has some suggestions. He has the case studies of thinking about financial activism. But of course, it's not the only one. But I kind of took him as a starting reference and tried to extend it to these other spaces. And then with Alexandria, just very briefly, what happened was again a very financialization, but in a different way, in a way that the state is much more involved. And the military state complex is very much involved in how these new city building projects are happening. So we ended up on a dark role-playing game of trying to think about this fishing area in Alexandria and the way it's shifting with the different agents that inhabit it. So it's becoming a kind of way of trying to think of how to activate a classroom in something that's, that goes slightly further than exchange of knowledge, maybe. That's.
I guess, so does it kind of end at speculation? There's not sort of a desire or intent to then try to experiment with implementation? Is it just kind of getting people to have those kinds of thought experiments?
That's actually a good point, because I think, again, as I'm running through things, I'm not solidifying the ideas. So I think speculation, like the way that I'm discussing speculation and these people that I'm reading are discussing speculation, which maybe makes sense when you watch Tesla, is not. Like the claim is that it's not about the abstract thought experiment or that thing that we usually ascribe to art as, you know, all we're doing is like to project. Like there's nothing wrong with it, you know, you can imagine different scenarios, you can, you know, use science fictional forms to imagine different scenarios. But they have like the actual effects and, you know, footprints on the material world. Like Tesla form is like where you see how, you know, finance and speculation literally like is linked to factory production and to the way that the infrastructure, you know, Tesla Gigafactory is running across the planet and extracting resources, whether it's like lithium batteries or, so it has different manifestations. But like what we are doing also, you know, is not to only stay with, you know, imagining otherwise, but try to think about like how this can turn into resources. So like we're working with this community in London now at Tottenham. There was this Saturday school / kitchen project that they're evicted out of their space basically since August due to like rising, you know, like constantly rising, forever rising gentrification of Tottenham. So now we're working on a project with them which involves a lot, but the kind of finishing, the end goal in mind is try to think about how they can purchase land for themselves and try to think about, you know, like get into that vulgar game of like what's usually taken as vulgar, as like, you know, if you want these communities to survive, like maybe they need to enter that space of, you know, how the perpetrators are functioning.
So there's a question back and then this one.
Where? Oh, wow, okay.
What would Mike's thing up in the house?
So while the mic's going up, I'm just going to ask a question. To do with speculation as the thing you're advocating for, and I think what's quite striking when people encounter your work and your writing is the way that when you speak about solidarity, we kind of get that in raw because we're, you know, sort of left rules. And then when you speak about in your earlier work, you had an interest in regulation. And as you said, that came partly, I think you were doing that within the art market as a kind of delocalized, decentralized. Institutions are kind of very doing whatever they want, and of course there's huge amounts of exploitation going on in art institutions. And regulation seemed at that time a good way to think about producing more just results. And you kind of see the shortcomings of that approach for the reasons you spelled out, which is because art is so decentralized. You can't really regulate in one place if you're susceptible to a broader global economy of art and movement of actors and so on, which kind of replicates a lot of the discourse around global markets, which is you can't tax too heavily in one place, which is a form of financial regulation, because then people will go elsewhere. So there's kind of, as you keep on sort of saying in that part of the presentation, there's a way in which the art world, not just the art market, but the art world kind of reproduces these global structures. But you move to speculation as a kind of point of emancipation, or some of the things that you were looking for with the discussion of solidarity and regulation, which again I think are quite easy to get behind, especially from the broader political field. It's much harder from the left, or the critique of capitalism, which I think you still subscribe to get behind speculation, because it's been taken in so much by marketization, capitalism, and the rest of it. So can you just say a little bit about what you see speculation, how you see it aligned with, and kind of improving in a way the things that you were trying to do with the discussion of solidarity and regulation? And I think the critique of those terms seemed clear to me from your presentation. We can go over them again if people need to rehearse it. But speculation is doing a lot of like good work for you, and like it's heading towards justice. If you could just say a little bit more about why you think that, and why it's the right place to kind of locate the kind of emancipatory and demands for justice that we're all into.
I think that might be a bit of a, that I hope it doesn't turn into the heavy theory, because that's probably the heavy theory part. Like, because I think that's the problem, like we haven't seen that many functional political works to be like, here it is, like I can discuss, you know, a good political utilization of speculation in this project. So this is what I think the people I'm engaging with are trying to figure out. But in theory, I think there are two things. One is, my claim is that, and along like other people, I'm not inventing it, is that there's no other way than speculation. Like speculation is here to stay, and it was here. It's not like a new kind of phenomenon of financialization, but people like Randy Martin, Brian D, like, you know, those old, like people who were writing before even the recent rise of writing on finance, like their claim is that the promissory is part of, you know, any kind of exchange, like it's embedded into monetary forms. Like it's not that if you pay for something and you get, you know, a good back, like the exchange ends there. Like there's always a kind of expectation, a futural element built into any form of exchange. And so trying to reduce those terms of those modes of exchange into essentialized ideas of value or forms of value that maybe those older models with regulation are trying to do, because basically they want to say this thing essentially has value, or, you know, land or labor, or, you know, there's like essential value to every object, or to certain objects that they see important. I don't think that's quite true, because it doesn't capture what's promissory with economic relations / with everything. So that's exactly where I think having, you know, for a left not to kind of capture the promissory in the proposals, like they're bound to not kind of tap into a space of desire that, you know, we all like occupy. So this is one side of it. The other side is maybe more concretely, again, just in terms of theory, there are writers, philosophers like Robert Meister, whose project has been for many years to think about redistributive justice and reparations, but in a way to really seriously consider what could be, you know, redistributive justice at times of financialization. When basically what we have is that wealth is not just accumulated here and now, but like most of this kind of accumulated centuries-long colonial wealth is captured in financial markets as options into the future. So where he starts is that it's not enough, it's not sufficient to think about you know, justice as something that's limited now, but justice is quite literally an option. So he wants to bring in a liberal, you know, the liberal discourse. He wants to bring it into the discussions around redistributive justice, and, you know, it's kind of a play on the word, because options are some form of financial product. But he's saying like everybody should have the option, you know, like it's not that we want to kill the future, we also want to be able to have the choice to select. So, you know, it's like after the critique of neoliberalism, after critiques of liberalism, like we want to kind of like go back to capture something of, you know, that choice and that optionality that actually does matter, and we need to manage it with these projects they have now. So that kind of, I think that's the more controversial thing of like bringing trying to hold on to something that's neoliberalism slash liberal philosophy was trying to address. Yeah.
Okay. So there's 1, 2, 3. Do you want to ask a question?
Hi, yeah, thank you, that was great. I really enjoyed the last video as well. So my question, I think what struck me about the presentation was the glossary, or the weird economies part of it. I found that really interesting. A lot of what you're going over feels more like an exploration, and the glossary felt closer to like a statement or a perspective on like a way of understanding and accessing terminology that isn't necessarily well understood. So I guess my question is, will that glossary continue, or do you intend for that glossary to continue to grow? Because it's quite limited at the moment, and is the intent with that as a tool sort of towards justice and education? I guess it also relates to the first question about education, because I think it's really important. Like redefinition is like, to me, a key way to sort of challenge maybe outdated or not completely accurate ideas about what's very complex, difficult to understand system.
Yeah, I mean, the way I was thinking about the glossary didn't actually happen as such. Like, I thought it would be a way of, like what I said, you know, bringing this dense language, like to, you know, show how it mirrors in social life in very quotidian terms. But the people we invited, they actually made even added more complexity to each term, because they're all, you know, super great thinkers. So it didn't turn out to be that kind of a translation of the, you know, financial lingo into social life. It just became its own thing, but it's going to be ongoing. I think, yeah, maybe that educational aspect, to be honest, is not quite happening with the glossary as is now, but it's more happening in the workshop formats. So that's where I can, you know, because you need time to break down these concepts. Like, it's not easy. It's not, adding up too much if you just run over things in maybe an hour. Like, it really needs like some protracted teaching module. But yeah, I mean, that was the idea, but it just didn't happen.
Hi. My question is just about block. I know you started to talk about it a second ago, but I'm still just a little bit confused about it. I guess you didn't really have time to go over it, but I didn't understand how the gatherings were like different than the public performance spaces, or like how you meant to like infiltrate our institutions, with what you were like presenting it as a socialist project and like a critique of neoliberalism, but the things that you were mentioning were like reputational platforms or investor activism, which like, wouldn't those be like consumer subject or subject-oriented methods of change, which aren't those like, wouldn't be seen as like more liberal approach rather than like, I don't know, tenant organizing or like rent control or public housing or nationalization. So in a way, like, I guess my question is, how does it actually attack like from a socialist perspective, like a structural change rather than one that is a liberal oriented one?
So you don't mean Block, probably you mean weird economies, right? Just to make sure. Block was the modular education platform on education, on gentrification.
I see, so it was an educational platform. I thought you were organizing with tiered that on that.
Yeah, so that project basically turned out to be 6 teaching modules that we would provide to art institutions to teach to their BA students. So they could invite us and we would work with activists on the ground. So there was this whole model of like, we're also not just landing from outside, but we go collaborate with housing rights activists in the area, like invite them to also teach, along us, and then it would be some kind of a multi-scale approach. So maybe something that we could, like this kind of education on financialization at large, plus more specific history of the locations, which is actually what's happening with weird economies now. Like that kind of multi-scalar approach is happening in education. But it was very much about education.
I see, thanks.
Yeah.
Who was next?
Hey, since it's in the polycrisis section, I was wondering, I want to push against a little bit the kind of faith and speculation side of things in the current context, and I sort of wonder to what extent does the kind of futural, I can't remember the phrase you used, but the kind of futural abundance that was kind of implied since the 2008 kind of era, not necessarily abundant for all, but somehow there was always more risk to be used, more kind of like space to further financialize and to, it's almost like, you quote Esposito, she said something like, in 2008 we used up a lot of futures, but then we turned out to have loads more futures left, and then, like, central banks kept on giving, buying up assets, blah, 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 blah. All that stuff that happened over the last, 15 years, but like now, I mean, you're also quite involved in various kinds of activism with the war in Russia and in Ukraine and all sorts of other things. Do you think that faith and speculation, that kind of abundance of possible ways to kind of reshape and sort of choreograph these different temporal instruments and always even those ways of thinking about them and about the implied, I don't know what form of liquidity this is, but the implied liquidity basically of being able to strategize almost anything using the tools that finance seem to offer. Do you think that's still with us? Because at the same time, right now, with supply chain crises, with all of these other things going on, even mainstream economics seems to be coming, down to a point where it's like, oh, maybe we can't just use money to measure and control everything with interest rates and stuff. Maybe we have to think about where does oil actually come from, or where does plastic bits get made, and this kind of stuff around the world. And people are starting to talk about how many ships do we have, and what volume of cargo can they carry, and how much further do they have to go now, and this kind of stuff, so which feels like it's actually really constraining the temporal space that we have to operate in, also to imagine it. I'm just wondering how you're thinking about this kind of material stuff.
Honestly, I think maybe this last project is the first time that I'm really trying to think about infrastructure and logistics in that relationship to finance. But I think I probably won't have great answers for it. I think your question is really, it needs some good, research. Thinking. I don't know what would you say, so
Well, I think I addressed to both of you, but there is also inspired your work. There's something over the last 15 years with this kind of thinking, which I think does sort of is a post-crisis,
I mean, it is a problem that this is what Dyer Whitford talks about, how post-scarcity, of course, post-scarcity conversations now have to speak to ecological crisis, first and foremost. And yeah, I mean, it becomes a really existential debate, because I think, if you ask me, I think I'm deep down cynical in thought, it's very Gramscian, I'm cynical in thought, but I just keep up a smiley face. But I don't, I think given that, I still think maybe, it becomes an existential philosophical debate, because I think if we're ending either way, I think still speculation at least allows for a better life than than going back to what was there before. I don't know if it's making sense. It's just very abstract. Yeah, please.
Just to follow through on what Gary was asking. So you didn't mention it at all, but I think it's part of your online persona that you're very involved in the activism in Iran and the insurrection that's been happening. And I think that's preoccupied you quite a lot since it kicked off, and actually before that, because you were involved in kind of the version of Me Too in Iran, I think in 2020. And so the kind of feminist moment of what's happening now was a kind of like a minor precursor of that within the art institutions 2-3 years ago. So just to take up Gary's question, like it seems to be one of the things that's going on in Iran. In the West, it's presented very much as a kind of gender equality demand, but that cloaks a huge amount of crises within Iran itself, including the drought that's been going on for like, I don't know, 15 years or something like this. Problems with the state not kind of providing basic provisions, kind of the way that Islamic rearguard actions are kind of in confrontation between each other and progressive moments in the state and so on. So there's a whole number of things. The drought was also to do with food crises, I think, within Iran, and kind of massive inequality, because neoliberalism is also like the dominant economic model within Iran. But we don't see any of that stuff here unless you kind of read, or in English, unless you're doing a lot of very close reading of Al Jazeera, I think. It's sort of one of the few outlets of that stuff in mainstream media. But your involvement in that, as I've followed it, is kind of aware of the kind of multifaceted aspects of what's going on in Iran, but still very much has the feminist claim at the core of the discourse and the kind of work that you're doing online. So it seems to me like the Iran situation is very much about material constraints and the kinds of limitations that Gary was pointing to in terms of Iran kind of operates in the single space because of sanctions, which is driving a lot of the problems that are, if Iran wants to deal with agriculture breakdown because of the drought, it can't appeal to global markets because it's heavily sanctioned by the West. So it drives into Russia. It drives its arms into Russia, and that leads to all kinds of other problems, especially with the current sanctions regime. But I'm wondering whether, given the sort of material, systemic, infrastructural constraints that are part of your interventions in terms of the politics of Iran at the moment, whether and how speculation kind of feeds into that. And I think your position around the discourse, I'm not following it very closely because it's a bit too much for me to have to get into. I don't know how fancy. How speculation kind of is generative for you in dealing with that particular situation.
No, thanks for adding that concrete case, because now I can actually think about Gary's question with less levels of abstraction in my head. I think actually, so what's happening, at least for the past 4 months in my head, it's one of these moments that is hard to describe unless I'm sure like some of you have been going through these very disruptive moments and where you're familiar with the context that you're familiar with. But for me, like the past 4 months, there was this massive kind of learning experience on a complete, like fresh form of imagination that's not bounded, and not me, I'm just like me as the prototypical subject of someone who has that background of thinking about politics in that sense, and then being placed in a revolutionary situation. The first thing that happens is that you have the capacity to think beyond the state. Like the first thing that really breaks down is that like somehow something happens to your mind, you think you can live without the state. And then you can start thinking about, so what's, what do we do? And it's important to mention that some of the greatest work, like this moment, is the accumulation of very great, consistent, dangerous organizing work of many people. So there's been, 40 years of, and beyond, like 40 years and more before the Islamic Republic's regime, of workers' unions, teachers' coalitions, retirees, you name it. So there's been a lot of very grounded, amazing organizing work that's been happening that's accumulated to this moment. And specifically with the workers' movement in Iran, it's something that's less discussed. But that's where some of the most radical thinking has been happening. So, yeah, it's not to, this is where you can actually think about these sites of labor as still holding that kind of, potential for some kind of, I don't know how to call it, the kind of gathering that's needed, the gathering of the bodies that the state prevents in other forms. So some of the models that they've been developing and actually started to become part of the mainstream lingo since the events 4 months ago is council governance. So they've been really kind of seriously considering council governance as a kind of a step-by-step process from coalitions and councils within the factories to neighborhoods to different regions. And the way that they've been imagining this is also very particular to the conditions of the dynamics of different social groupings in Iran, because different regions are they're occupied by different nationalities. It's not ethnicities, it's quite literally different nations, multiple nations occupying that land. So council governance is a model that really would work, and they've actually implemented it in the factories. They've been, it's tested by them. So they are advocating for these models, but of course, it sounds a bit utopian because, how could a set of, interconnected councils address the geopolitics of the region, and which is something that's those countries are doomed by. But still, I think I don't know how to. I can't resolve the political conundrum of Iran in 5 minutes, but. There is something to be said about oil again, because there's this, what you call it, a curse of oil countries. Once you have oil, forever your borders are points of tension between, the exterior forces, what's called as, what's usually addressed as imperialist forces, and the interior states repression, forms of repression of the border. So the border is going to always be at tension. So actually, I was kind of drunk one night just talking to friends, but I think the best case scenario for Iran would be for the environmental movement, the global environmental movement, to win the fight. And that's where you get rid of oil, the primacy of oil, and that's when everyone can chill.
Is that the speculative moment?
That's the speculative moment for me. I was thinking to write maybe a sci-fi piece on that, but it's not sci-fi. I think that's really the only way out for it.
You're not cynical at all.
Hmm?
You're not cynical at all.
Hey, I have a weird question. I wondered if you, in your research, ever sort of encounter the topic of trendiness, because I kind of feel like these radical new ideas and initiatives that we talk about here, sometimes like Elon Musk's partner Grimes like has Instagram stories about like Marxism and like Mark Fisher and like DAOs, like decentralized autonomous organizations are like picked up by like World Business and so like this. So I wondered if you feel like this is something that needs to be sort of like short-circuited to make these new ideas like finance and artists and new forms of artistic practice sort of like flourish, or do you think that's something to like stay away from?
I think that's a good question, because I would change trendiness with what I was trying to say with reputation and kind of like a reputation warfare. And then it wouldn't be too difficult for us to understand, because we don't have to discuss finance to understand how reputation is built up on the social media space. And even like, again, making the Iranian Revolution a case, like I've also been thinking about there is very interesting shifts that's happening. For example, like there's a whole like celebrity influence culture that has started to take the position of the kind of, the older day, the counter-revolutionary fascists. But it's all coming through, the combination of the trolling that's funded by Israel, US, Saudi, slash, it's like there's a whole combination of actors that are enabling that kind of trolling space and the reputation warfare to happen. But yeah, and it's not real, because when you're in a revolutionary moment, then you see like how it's actually shifting and forming, how people perceive things are happening on the ground, which is not true. Or that you can't have an image of it, to be honest. Like I imagine not the majority of like people who are active online are fascists, but then when you have like funded trolling activity, then it's very hard to see like who's where. So yeah, I think trends and reputation is something that is important to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, we should finish, and I think that's a really good way to maybe come back to what some of Gary was asking, and because I didn't get to ask you about the practice and sort of your preparedness to be involved in some very abstract, large scale, planet-wide kind of configurations, which strikes me as being, it strikes me because it's very different to sort of modesty and sort of based in subjectiveness of, I think, a lot of contemporary art. But I'm wondering whether this question about because your answer was a bit like the symbolic space is actually a driver now, right? So through reputational enhancement or reputational warfare, that's treating reputation as an asset. And then you can degrade it, you can amplify it, and so on and so forth. But reputation and assets are primarily symbolic forms, right? And the symbolic forms are the ones that drive then real production, which I think might be a way of addressing what Gary was asking, which is it's not so much whether there's the real or the fictive space of abstract capital, but which one has a steering wheel. And I think the move towards the asset as the replaces the commodity, but also replaces where valuation is coming from. And that seems to be the place also where speculation becomes a kind of key. Speculation takes place in the symbolic space, not in the material space, because what you're speculating on is what's the future value of this. So assets drives valuation, drives material production. And I think that's where it seems to me what you're doing with, as an artist, kind of takes a different kind of role and power configuration than art's normally been relegated to. So in the industrial model, value emanates from production and material conditions. And then you kind of arrive at the symbolic as a very late thing. And then if you're a Marxist like Baudrillard, you're very sad because the symbolic's taken over. But it's a bit like you turn that around and sort of say, look, no, symbolic is a space for act. This is kind of full of, this is kind of contaminated with future values, which we're not yet in control of. And so there's something there where I think what art, along with other cultural production, and I think this is just a roundabout way of asking Steve a bit more, maybe by way of concluding, about that you don't really seem to, you seem quite promiscuous about whether you belong in the art space or not the art space, or Trezor, or kind of speaking to whichever finance corporate person or doing education initiatives. Yeah. So there's a kind of like relaxedness about the artiness of the practice. And I'm wondering if that's, well, okay, so that's what I want to get to. Yeah. But I wonder if that's tied up somehow with this kind of asset-based notion of art, or reputation-based notion of art.
Yeah, I mean, going back to your first question, the thing is, since I've been doing a PhD for 4 years, I haven't been hanging out with artists so much, so I don't know what's called an artist anymore. I just hang out with people who I like Gary. And my supervisor. So it's hard to know, like, that distinction is not so much in my head anymore, but also I think what I've been trying to do was kind of forcing myself to take up that agency of being an artist, given all the problematics all the contradictions that come with it, which started with getting to know Teardal and reading you and getting to know you. So everything started with that diagnosis of, if we claim to do critique in the art field, most of the times we're just contributing to the problem while doing the critique. Like, we do some good work, but we also get implicated in the same things that we're discussing. So really the rest of the practice just emerged out of that moment of trying to resolve the contradiction, knowing that the contradiction wouldn't be resolved, but like at least in the attempt to resolve it, like you kind of take over a sort of agency, and then you feel comfortable calling yourself an artist because at least you're trying to deal with that. Like, that problem became the content of the work, like the problem of critique. So yeah, I'm kind of happily taking the word artist as my yeah.
All right, let's stop there because I think we've massively overrun.
Yeah.